And I worked for 10 years at CBS Television in the music department. It doesn't exist anymore. This is like 50 years ago or more. But I learned a lot about television music. I learned how you produce it. I learned how different. I met a lot of composers. We used to hire composers. I used to track the shows. I used to go to the recordings. I met guys. I was on sessions with Bernard Herrmann and Jerry Goldsmith and Lalo Schifrin and Michel Legrand. I mean, all these great names. Alex North. And then I started doing my own writing. So by the time I got through television, I'd learned a lot about television. Then when I got into the movies, I had already had all these years of practice doing television, so the movies kind of just happened naturally. Once you get out of the movies and you go into the symphonic world, completely different group of people, completely different group of people.
And they don't know who you are.
They don't know who I am, and right. I don't know who they are.
Right.
So, if I were going to cold call somebody, and I've done that, then I'm going to cold call a director, and I'm going to find out some information about his film. I'm going to talk to my agent, and blah, 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 blah. But if I want a job from some orchestra, I got to start from scratch. The process of composing is pretty much the process of composing. I mean, there's some, like when you get into film, you have real conditions that you have to respect. Like, when I'm doing a concert piece, the hardest thing for me on a concert piece is trying to figure out the form. Because in a movie, you never, ever, ever think about form. You just go along with the movie, But when you're writing a real piece, or not a real piece, but when you're writing a piece that is just music and no picture to entertain you, you got to think about where you're going. So that makes a big difference. And also, in a movie, you have to get there by then, So you can't finish that idea. You might not finish the idea when you'd like to. It might be later, or it might be earlier. And then you have to write it in such a way that it just seems like the most natural way of getting there, even though it was really worked out.
Well, because in film music, there's still 8-bar phrases and things like this. They still exist, like these things that could be
if you have enough time for it.
Or enough time for it?
Well, no, I remember years ago, when I was working on the TV show Quincy, I wrote out a theme that I thought was a really cool theme, and I think I got to use about 3.5 bars of it. It was really disappointing, because there just wasn't any space in the movie. For what we had to play, there really wasn't any space for an 8-bar theme. We just never got that far,
So how far did you get?
About 3.5 bars.
So 3.5 out
yeah, so I had a good hook,
They must have been a pretty damn good 3.5 bars then if they kept that in, didn't put it down to 1 bar or something.
Yeah, it really just depends. So, and other times you find yourself you write an 8-bar tune and you wish it had been a 16-bar tune because you're just sitting there spinning it out, waiting for something to change.
So what made you decide at some point, because you did all these films like Tombstone and Young Sherlock Holmes and Silverado, all these big films, especially in the 80s, 90s.
Yeah.
What made you change to do concert music? And then I guess my follow-up to that is how did you fit into that? Because you were also, you're playing a violin on all these big scores. When he starts to do all these things that are more in the concert music space, how would you react to that? Or would you help him with the violin licks and vice versa?
Well, she always helped me with violin licks.
Well, I guess I started in the symphonic stuff. I went into the London Philharmonic when I think I was 17, and London Symphony, and then I did opera. So I did a chunk of classical stuff, and then I left, and then did 20 years of studio playing, and that was films, rock and roll, jingles. Lots of really cool rock and roll, actually. The 80s was a really cool time to be doing that. And then the films, and then we got together, and then as far as you writing concert music, occasionally you will ask me if this works, that works. But actually, I have to say Bruce has a really, really good knowledge of each instrument.
Okay, so
more than anybody I know, actually.
No, I have a story about that. So, Belinda, when we met, or when we finally got together, she was living in London and I was living in LA. It wasn't practical in a dating thing, We worked it out, but we did an awful lot of writing back and forth, and we would fax things and call each other twice a day and all that stuff. So I wrote some violin pieces, some solo violin pieces, and I sent them to her. And she would write back, she says, "Oh, thank you so much for the." I said, "Do they work for?" "Oh, yes, they're lovely." So then we got married. And after we got married, I wrote her some more violin pieces, and I said, "Look, I've written you some more pieces. How are those?" And she looked at it. And the first thing she said was, "Well, they don't go very high." I went, "What?" "Well, they don't." And this thing here, there's a neat effect you might want to know. I mean, it turned out that I didn't know that much about violin. If I had to write a real violin piece, and I've had to a couple of times, I'll take it to her and make sure that it's workable, And
But
she always has something.
I think that's
to,
because when you're writing in the studios, you don't have time. If you write anything too complicated, it's going to take too long.
Yeah, that's true.
So you write in a safer way. But when you write a solo piece, the chains are off. You can go for it, and that's all I was trying to say was, look, there's all this
Yeah.
as well.
But I mean, in that case, she knows all that stuff. And, I mean, that's true of. I'm basically a pianist. I was a mediocre horn player. I know how the horn works. I know how all brass instruments work. I know the fingerings and all blah, 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 blah. But I wrote a horn concerto a couple of years ago and worked out some things where I had worked out the fingering and found out that he didn't play it that way. He played it on the double horn. The fingerings are completely different. And I said, well, that makes no sense to me because, this, no, it's on the double horn. And I didn't know about that because my horn playing didn't get to double.
Didn't get a double.
I could barely do single. So
That's funny. Well, I mean, it is a big difference when you're doing a violin concerto or something, or solo violin, versus writing a piece for a string orchestra or something like this, because you have to account for obviously how many players are playing each part. There's this level of homogeneity between the players, and obviously you play a solo violin piece, you can rehearse the thing however long you want, but with the string orchestra piece or something, you can't rehearse for that long. But you wrote a really brilliant string orchestra piece that we can hear right now. This piece called String Theory. We're going to hear a 2-minute excerpt of it. This is from the first part of it. It's organized with prelude, theme, and variations. You got a ton of variations, and then a finale.
Well, there's a reason why it was called String Theory, so I can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, of course. But let's hear. Well, you're going to talk about it right now. But first, we're going to hear the excerpt.
What I was trying to do was, for the last several years, like when we met, I was working over at USC, and I was working primarily in the film TV scoring thing. Occasionally, I would go to Thornton and do a lesson, which is how we met. But as I was doing these orchestration lessons, the one thing I realized was a lot of composers, when they go through school, they don't learn orchestration. I mean, some of them had never, they all came there with a bachelor's degree, but a lot of them had not ever studied orchestration. Those who had taken maybe one semester and had studied it out of a book. We had more than a group of composers who had never had anything recorded, never had anything played. I mean, it sounds kind of outrageous, but and it is outrageous. So we had a deal, USC had a deal with the union, it still has it, whereby we could assign pieces as quartets and small groups, occasionally small orchestras, and we could get professional musicians to come in and read the stuff and play it. So for a lot of people, this was really the first time they'd ever come in contact with instrumentation. So I realized when we talk about string, we talk about strings, woodwinds, brass, and all that kind of stuff. I would talk about the effect of strings, let's say violins and octaves, as opposed to violins and violas and octaves, or violins and cellos and octaves, or violas and cellos and octaves, or cellos and basses, or whatever it was. And I would show them examples, and I would play them examples, and then I realized they really don't know it. They really haven't heard it. It's not. In order to be a good orchestrator, you have to memorize the sounds. You have to know the sounds. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do a series of pieces. I was going to do it originally as an afternoon talk, right? Mm. Put together something, the strings sound like this, the violins sound like this, the violas sound like that. And then I thought, well, maybe I could do a video on it, and I started writing it, and it took me a while, and then I got carried away. I ended up with this big string piece that's like 25 minutes long.
Yeah, it's a big one.
So
it's difficult.
Yeah, some of it's really difficult.
Especially later on.
But the first, the very first, the theme is violins in unison. The very first variation is violins in octaves. Okay, it's not a huge difference, but it's different than violins and violas. And I've got a variation with violins and violas. Another one with violins and violas in unison. I've got them when they're 2 octaves apart. I've got violas and cellos, cellos and basses, basses without cellos, cellos and violas separate and together. And then I have things like pizzicato and soltasto, sulpanicello, all sorts of marcato. Pardon me?
Col legno?
Col legno. Did I do that? I don't know.
I think so.
I probably
Harmonics.
left that one out. But yeah, I've got one that are entirely harmonics. Everybody's playing harmonics. Ricochet. Yeah, it's all really interesting. So it's sort of like the young person's guide to the orchestra, except that it's more complicated, I think, for an audience. And I tried to make it as though it were a good concert piece. But it's really just a series of techniques.
Yeah,
then at the very end, I try to use them all together.
It's a young guide for a composer, really, not so much for a general young person, and because when I was looking at it, first of all, when I saw the first page, I'm like, okay, the theme is pretty simple, you know, and then I get to the second page, I'm like, oh, he does it again, but like I wasn't really looking at the score that intensely, and then I hear it again, I'm like, okay, there's some, and then I look at the score further, and I notice that it's getting more and more different, a little, but barely. And I was like, oh shit, I get it now. Yeah. But it takes a while. But the simplicity of the sound in the beginning, it actually takes you away from it a little bit. But then once you commit to hearing 2-3 minutes of it, you're like, oh crap, this is what's going on. And it's completely different than what you initially expect when you hear something like that from the start. So I didn't even realize it was going to be, because when you say the piece is going to be theme and variations, you think, okay, the variations are going to be extremely different, but I didn't realize the variations were going to be different in terms of the orchestration, So that was
just a string orchestra, So there's like, how many ways can you make a string orchestra sound like something else, or not something else, but how long can you keep it interesting?
Yeah, but a lot of those techniques in there, I just wonder, from your film music days, a lot of those, would you say that a lot of those things that you did in this piece are applicable to a film music scoring environment?
Oh, yeah. I've often said everything I ever learned in music, everything I ever learned about composition or orchestration, literally, except form, I could use, even form, I could use in a film. Because, you get a film, And maybe you've done 20, 30 films, or in my case, a couple of hundred TV episodes. And then you get a piece of film and you've just never done anything like that. You need to do something that's different. You need to use new techniques. Maybe you have to pretend as though you're writing in another style or in another language, like maybe you've got a story about Chinese history. And, I'm not Chinese, and I know bupkis about Chinese music, but I have to do it in a way that the audience can understand it and that it's not laughable. I have a Turkish friend who's a composer, and he complained to me one time. He says, where do you guys get your idea of Middle Eastern music? And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, it's always just so stupid, I mean, it's like you get a couple of bazookies and you play it and you think that's it. I said, well, it isn't necessary in film to really get the style down adequately. You just need to get it so that it has the sense of, sort of like the actors and the actresses wearing costumes and, that kind of stuff. Yeah, he said, but now with YouTube and with music going all over the world, you guys ought to do it better. And I said, okay, no, point well taken, that's great. 6 or 7 months later, he sends me his score to a Western that was made in Turkey. I thought, oh, this will be really interesting to hear what this is.
And go the other way around.
Well, yeah, it sounded like Elmer Bernstein with bazookies. I mean, it was really pretty weird. I mean, it was sort of Western, but I mean, he had done the same thing to us as we do to them.
Right.
So, anyway,
I was going to say, just apropos of what you were saying, that when I was working in the studios, I would be asked to play in different styles.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it's Celtic or I'm trying to think of the different styles, Argentinian.
Yeah.
I did some klezmer, country. I would be asked to play in the Celtic style, and I would go and study it and make sure that I got it right, and I'd be really intense about it and spend days and days figuring it out, putting all the inflections in. And they'd give me the tune or the whatever they'd written, and then I would put the inflections in. And when almost 99% of the time I'd turn up at the studio, and the composer would say, that's way too much. And I'd say, oh, so I'd water it down a bit. Oh, that's too much. Oh, that's too much. So that sort of traditional ethnic sound was usually always too much, certainly for a movie anyway. They just wanted it's the difference between making mashed potato out of real potatoes and the boxed version. Yeah. The dehydrated potato flakes.
You kind of get out of it too when you're watching a movie or something. You hear this very different sound.
She showed me one time she had a solo. It started on a whole note on an open D, tied to another long note, another D. And then I think it went all the way to like a half note E or something. I mean, it was just like 2 or 3 pitches that went on for like 6 or 7
tight
bars.
Tight whole notes for
and I think
20, 40 bars.
He wanted to sound Irish.
He said, could you make it Celtic?
Make it sound Irish?
Yeah.
Yes, he said, could you make it Celtic? And I thought, what the fuck?
And she showed me, and she said, what am I going to do? And I said,
what do I do with that?
I don't know, but she did something.
I figured out something, yeah.
Have they ever asked you to play like in a avant-garde style or whatever that means, like play it like Ligeti Atmospheres or something, like people like I can think of like the John Corigliano piece, Altered States, that movie.
No.
Would they ever ask you to do any weird kind of aleatoric stuff?
I'm trying to think.
Just wondering, because you hear those kind of sounds a lot in film music.
Yeah, I've actually come up with some sounds. They were trying to get us. It's usually to do with color and emotion in the movies, and they just want this specific color, and they're not even sure what the sound is. And then one of them was like, instead of col legno with the bow, we had pencils with erasers on the end, and so they didn't want the sharpness of the woody sound of the col legno, so the dull thud of the eraser on the string was perfect. And I thought about it, and then got the section to do it. And that was the great sound. I mean, that's sort of aleatoric, isn't it? And then
well, you've probably
there was
done
another
it with
one.
Ben. No, you've probably done it with Ben Wolfish, because Ben does a lot of contemporary
Ben does
stuff.
that too. Yeah. Well, the other one was. I mean, I don't know. I tried to not name names too much. So, but there are times like that when they want an effect or a sound or an emotion, and sometimes you can just make it up. And as I said, the eraser one was one, and another one was this incredibly sort of it's like bowing across on the fingerboard with literally like one hair of the bow, and it was just sort of whistling.
Whisper
It wasn't even
sound,
flatando;
yeah.
it was less than flatando.
Yeah.
And it was cool. But that's about it. They haven't asked too much.
The composers make it up. I mean, some of the composers, I won't name names either, but...
Hey, if you want to name names,
No, I'm not going to do it because...
Do it.
No, but I mean, there are some composers who, I'll name names here, who are really good, and they really know what they're doing. I mean, James Newton Howard, he's really good. He knows what he's doing. John Powell is really good. Al Silvestri's really good. John Williams, who obviously is, got a lot of technique. He's really good. There are a lot of guys, Jerry Goldsmith and all that. There are a lot of guys. But there are a lot of people who are, it's not even a matter of being that well trained. They just don't study. And I'm not even talking about the illiterate ones yet, You don't have to be a skilled orchestrator, skilled composer to work well in films. And that's not because films is just full of crappy music. It's because film music really is about producing an emotion. So what does it matter how you do it? Like Johan Johansson did a lot of sound design. I remember watching one of his scores. I thought it was great. He probably had 5 tones in the whole thing. But the whole concept of his music and the way that it worked with the film, I thought was brilliant. It wasn't like, I don't know, didn't sound like Bach, but it was still really good. But I've heard other guys who try to do that, and they sound like crap, And the other thing is, I should not just say guys. Let me be fair, guys and women, men and women together, because everybody's composing now. Everybody.
And men and women are equally capable of producing.
They are equally capable of writing some really bad music, just like guys are.
Yeah.
Guys took the lead, and the women followed. I mean, you hear people say, "Oh yeah, I write in this style, and I'm the follower of." So anyway, it's one thing to be Hans Zimmer. It's another thing to be a Hans Zimmer acolyte and write in his style. It's not this. I mean, even Hans, for my money, gets a bad rap. I mean, he's not John Williams in terms of his training, but he's awfully good with film. He's a very clever guy with what he does. So I don't knock him. I don't know what he'd be like to write a symphony. Actually, I do know what he'd be like. But for films, I think he's awfully good.
But I think some composers are interested in the job they're doing and not. I mean, I'm not naming names, but there was a composer who came over to the house and they wanted help from you. They wanted to show you something, and you got into it. You got involved in what they were writing, and you wanted to show them. Went back to your room and brought out some scores, and they weren't interested. And you'd think, as a composer, you'd be really interested in. I'm not even. I can't remember the subject exactly or what it was.
It was a game, and the question I got from the composer was, "You think this will work? Think this will work? How is it? Do you think that'll work? Think this will work?" So you go, "Well, yeah, sure."
That's strange. I've never had an experience where I asked the teacher, "Will this work?" It's more of a discussion, and then if you want to say something about it, you say something.
Yeah.
Because in general, I feel like generally speaking, if you're trying something new, teacher doesn't know either if it's going to work.
Yeah.
I've had many lessons with John Corigliano, or even I remember some lessons with you. We were sitting there thinking about something, and we're both trying to figure out, hey, what do you think of this? And I don't know. Let's hear it.
Well, I mean, you were working on a quartet, and you were working on a harp piece, and you had some little device. And I remember you saying, "I'm going to try this," because I asked you, "What is this?" "I'm going to try this." And like a week later or so, I tried that. It didn't work very well.
Oh, it was
so
terrible.
now on to something else. Yeah. So I mean, that happens, right?
Yeah. Of course.
I remember reading about Jerry Goldsmith saying that he would be up late the night before a session, worrying about whether it would work. He was going to try this, but in a movie, it's a little bit different because it really does have to work. That is, it has to produce the effect that's being called on by the person you're working for. So I worked on a comedy one time. Well, I can say who it was, with Alan Alda. Alan's a very bright guy. He's a good writer. He's a good actor. He understands comedy and timing, all this other kind of stuff. So we were working on our first film together, and which meant that we didn't really know each other that well, and we got into a scene that he thought should be funnier than it was. Okay, he's the director, so he's right, you know. And he didn't think it was funny at all. And so I kept working on it, And the solution we finally came up with was something that I wouldn't have thought was funny, and probably wouldn't have been funny to 8 out of 10 other directors. But the way Alan understood music, and he was no dope. His wife was a really fine clarinet player, or maybe is, Arlene. The way that he responded to the music was the way that he responds to music. And it's not the way everybody else responds to music. So in order for that piece of mine to work, I've got to know something about his metabolism, actually, you know.
Right.
And it's not like you write a symphony and go, hey, yeah, that was really nice. That's, you know, very good. And you get a good review in the New York Times or a bad review. I mean, it's all nonsense. In a film, no, that works. I'm sorry, kid, that doesn't work. I'm not going to put that music in my film.
Yeah.
I've had people say that in a much ruder fashion. You know, I'm not putting that, you know, in my movie. So change it. So I change it until it works.
No, I mean, I remember having not this exact scenario, but this kind of general exact discussion with you.
Yeah.
And I had it with you. I had it with James Van Howard as well, because it was around the same time I was trying to figure out, because you were the two guys that I knew reasonably well that were in the film business, because I was figuring out, am I going to do film? Right. And a lot of my students, you know, this is the ongoing issue, I think, with composers. A lot of us, they get into it because of the film. You know, of course, we all have Netflix and stuff like that now. That's where we hear symphonic music for the first time. But then most of these guys or girls don't know that there's this other side to it, you know, the other side of how you can make music. So I remember having this kind of discussion with you, and this was one of the things. It's like, well, if you're okay with, you know, somebody, you know, ripping your music apart or using it or not using it, then it might be for you. But if it's not, if you have something else to say, you should pursue that. Yeah. And you said that, and James also said that.
Well, and
said the same thing.
He's been writing. He has a violin concerto. He has a cello concerto. Yeah. He's been, you know, trying to do that. No, the way I got into it was years ago when I was doing television. Before I got into larger forms like TV, movies, and all that kind of stuff, I was just doing episodes. And episodes had a real season. They began, for me, usually somewhere in September, and they would go until about the end of April. We had 24 episodes to do. And if you were the composer on the show, you'd do all 24 episodes, or as many as you could deal with. And then between April and September, you had all this time off. So during the year, usually somebody would ask me if I would write a piece for them. It'd be a flute player or a quartet, or somebody was doing something, and would you consider writing a piece for me? You go, yeah, sure, you know. So that's when I started doing that.
Well, so they would ask you to write something totally separate from the film, just for fun.
Yeah, just
kind of thing.
I'm writing.
Wow.
Like I remember this group of, there were three session players, flute players, who were going up to the national or international flute convention up in Seattle, something like that, and asked if I would write a piece for them, a flute trio. Okay, I had no reason to write a flute trio except for them, so I did it with 3 flutes and 3 piccolos. It was great, you know. It turned out to be a nice piece, and I learned a lot. And then a few years later, another flute player, actually one of them, asked me if I would write a piccolo concerto for the flute, International Flute Society. So I wrote a piccolo concerto. That one turned out really well. I mean, the last big performance we heard was in Cleveland, you know, with that orchestra. So the piece has gotten played a lot.
So that piece still gets played.
Yeah, it's still gets played.
One of the early ones.
And I've got 2 versions of it. A friend of mine made it's basically for piccolo and orchestra, and a friend of mine made a version for winds and piccolo, and it's a really great version. That was played just, I think, last year at Eastman or one of those schools. So, I mean, yeah, so it gets played. So it's worth doing. And the more you do it, the more you know what you don't know, the more you know about what you have to study or what you haven't learned. You know, you look at these pieces and you go, okay, if that were a film piece, it would be highly adequate. As a concert piece, yeah, some of it's highly adequate, some of it's not so highly adequate, some of it's barely adequate. And so that, you know, so these years, because now I'm older, I spend a lot of time erasing and reworking and all that kind of stuff, things that I never did 30, 40 years ago.
Well, I want to play something that's highly adequate.
Okay.
That's also concerto. Okay. And this is, I got my cheat sheet here. This is the second movement from your, I love this title, On the Sixth Day.
Yeah.
Because Thomas Otis has a piece in 7 days, kind of
really?
a similar title. Yeah. It's also a really good piece. But anyway, this is an excerpt from the second movement, Evening. And I thought it was kind of interesting because the opening is called Prologue, but the second movement is Evening, and the third movement is Morning.
Well, that's the way. I just follow. This isn't a religious piece, but it follows the timings in the Bible. The first thing is the evening, and then the morning follows. The prologue is actually in the beginning.
In the beginning.
And the reason I picked the sixth day was because the sixth day was when animal life occurred. You know, that's when all the whales and all the elephants and the tigers and the dogs and the cats and all that stuff, and people finally occurred. So that was when life comes out. The oboe represents life, consciousness,
Cool.
you know.
So let's hear these 2 minutes. This is like halfway into the second movement. There's this oboe solo thing going on with accompaniment, orchestral accompaniment, but then there's a certain point where you get that, I would call it the classic Bruce Broughton horn brass thing. Yeah, okay. I was like, oh, there he is. So I'm going to play that
But
section
the whole piece isn't this, okay?
It's not, no. Listen to the whole thing, but this is a fun part of it where I was, oh, there it is. So let's take a listen. It's not just a movie guide, not just a concert music guide. We're all writing music over here, you know. And I also hope, one day to be writing commercial music too, you know, whatever you want to call it, commercial music. And I hope that people that are in the commercial world are interested to do what we're doing over here and go to concerts and also support what we're doing in the concert music world and vice versa, because, we watch all the movies. So I feel like there should be more of a symbiosis going on, And there are some people like you guys that are definitely part of that. But I feel like there are a lot of people, this is an issue on both sides, I think, where they don't regard what the other side is doing as music.
Well,
it's like that intense, I think.
there are quite a few composers who don't write in between jobs, movie guys. They wouldn't think of writing music unless they had a job to do. So that's a different approach than a concert composer.
Yeah.
I mean, Bruce writes all the time. He's always writing.
Yeah.
And he's always listening to music. And so I don't know whether that causes the divide, but there is a divide, you're right.
Well, it's like, why are you writing? Why are you even doing it? Like, for example, like this oboe concerto, like why why did you decide all of a sudden, okay, like you wrote the piccolo concerto,
Well,
but
somebody,
then why
no,
all
it's
of a
the
sudden
same
this
reason
oboe
as a piccolo
concerto?
concerto. Somebody, an oboe player who was, I knew him from the studios in LA. He was a spectacular oboist. He had a most beautiful sound. And he called me up one day and he says, I want you to write me a concerto. And I thought, great. I know it's going to get played well. I don't know by whom, but, And he said, I want you to make it hard. And I said, well, that's easy because I don't know anything about oboe. So I wrote the piece and sent it to him. And we had a date to play it. And then unfortunately, shortly after, he died. So it never got performed until the recording that I made last year, which will be out in a couple of months. So I had this oboe concerto,
So the piece was written 2004, right?
Yeah.
Around that time. But you haven't heard it until now?
I didn't hear it until, last year we recorded it with the LSO. And I hadn't heard it, but I always thought that it was a good piece. I liked the piece. And it's not a, it's not a big Hollywood piece. I don't think anybody would see it that way. It has lots of different stuff in it, but I said I recorded with the LSO, and my oboist on that was the principal of the LSO, Olivier Stankiewicz, and so I just sent it to Olivier. And I said, "Hey, would you be interested in playing this?" And he said, "Yeah, I would." And he likes it. He said, "No, this." I said, "Does it sit well?" He says, "Yeah, it's all very playable," and he made it sound beautiful. So now I've got an oboe concerto. I've got a piccolo concerto, a horn concerto, an oboe concerto, a tuba concerto, which gets played a lot.
Cello.
Because they probably don't have much repertoire to play, probably. Also,
the tuba
piccolo,
concerto probably
tuba.
gets played more than anything because it's a light piece. It exists in a form with piano, and a tuba player told me recently he thought it was probably the most played tuba piece in the world for college recitals.
Wow.
It gets played a lot,
I remember when I was at Juilliard, I was, some days, and I feel like you're like this too. Some days I just go into the library and I just start browsing the music library and see what's just randomly. And I used to do that a lot at USC, like every week. And I was looking in the B's, and just to see, if any of your music made it at the Juilliard library, and the tuba. I think the tuba sonata was in there.
It's the same piece. Yeah.
The same piece, yeah. So I remember thinking, wow, he's here, but where is his other stuff? Why is it just that piece?
Well, okay, so that's a problem in composing, I think, or maybe it's just a problem with me. But because I went into television first, in fact, before I went freelance composing, I worked for 10 years at CBS Television in the music department. It doesn't exist anymore. This is like 50 years ago or more. But I learned a lot about television music. I learned how you produce it. I learned how different. I met a lot of composers. We used to hire composers. I used to track the shows. I used to go to the recordings. I met guys. I was on sessions with Bernard Herrmann and Jerry Goldsmith and Lalo Schifrin and Michel Legrand. I mean, all these great names. Alex North. And then I started doing my own writing. So by the time I got through television, I'd learned a lot about television. Then when I got into the movies, I had already had all these years of practice doing television, so the movies kind of just happened naturally. Once you get out of the movies and you go into the symphonic world, completely different group of people, completely different group of people.
And they don't know who you are.
They don't know who I am, and I don't know who they are.
Right.
So, if I were going to cold call somebody, and I've done that, then I'm going to cold call a director, and I'm going to find out some information about his film. I'm going to talk to my agent, and blah, 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 blah. But if I want a job from some orchestra, I got to start from scratch.
Yeah. And is it the same with you? Like if you wanted to play like in an orchestra, I guess the same thing. If you can't just play in the LA Phil, one day sub for the LA Phil, or did you do things like that?
They do that, yeah.
So you would sub?
I think it's harder for regular symphony players to suddenly come across into the studios and sight read.
Why is that?
Because they don't have to in the way we do, and that we're reading stuff at speed and no time to rehearse. It's quite demanding, especially on the sight reading. I often would have people come and play to me, some really terrific players, wanting to get into the studios. Excuse me, and they what they played was lovely, and I would then put up some cues. I'd keep cues for sight reading. And many just couldn't do it. And I would make them just keep going as if there was a click track going. And keep going, and they'd stop and stumble. I said, no, you got to keep going. That's what you do in the studios. You got to keep going. And
Do you put the click track on them too to see how they handle the click?
I sometimes yes. If they're way off, I give them some chances to play it again and try it again. And then sometimes you got to get the music in there too. You've got to actually start pull it about a bit and make it sound musical, but still get to the end of the bar at the right time.
I feel like the same thing when you're composing concert music too, because like when I did short little films, I was writing so quickly, like I could barely even keep up with the schedule, right? I mean, this is basically. But when you're writing concert music, it's the exact opposite problem. You have all the time in the world. It feels like, and then you are stopping yourself because you keep thinking, oh my God, that bar. Oh, it could be half a second longer.
Right.
Oh, it could be, but in reality, nobody gives a damn.
Or can't tell the difference.
Yeah.
I look at music written, by anybody when I see a student, and the first bar is in 7/8, but it's a long note, and the next bar is in 4/4, the next bar is in 7. And I said, do you think if you'd written it all in 4/4, anybody would be able to tell the difference? That they would have missed that extra half beat that you took out? And they just look at me kind of like, oh, I never thought of that. I mean, it's ridiculous what you do just because the music's in front of you. Mm-hmm. When you've got a movie, you don't do that.
Right, because there's an engraving and all this kind of stuff. It goes out the window.
Well, there's also, the great thing about it, and I think this is true of players too, is that you don't know what's going to come up. So you get your piece, you go through all your anxiety and all that kind of stuff, and you're in a recording session, which is 6 hours long. It starts at this and it ends there, and you have 10s. And you have to get a certain amount of music done. And then the director says, I hate that. That's not going to work. And so you look at it and you go, oh, okay. Well, what do you hate? Well, I don't like it. And you go, oh, okay, I can fix this. So they say, okay, trombones in bar 30 through 32, don't play that. Trumpets, lay out horns. Let me give you some new notes. And so then you start rewriting it on the stand. One time we were doing a show with a director who was, he was a lot of fun to work with. And it was a short piece, it was like 20, 25 seconds. And he came out as we did it, and he said, that's not what you said you were going to do. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, remember, there's a scene before this, it's a jazz thing at a jazz club, and you're going to keep the jazz feel and blah, blah. And I said, oh, that's right, yeah, I remember that. He said, so what are we going to do? I said, go away. Give me 15 minutes. So,
wow.
So I looked at my score and I thought, okay, I've got a bass player, he can play chords. I've got a trumpet player, he can improvise. I've got a guitar in here. I've got a keyboard player. I've got a sax player. Oh, I can, okay. So I gave them chords, and I said the strings can keep their parts the way they are because we were going to keep the harmonies. And I changed a few things and said, you take the solo here, you take the solo there, you do the drums here, and give me this at bar 6 and all that kind of stuff. These guys can do it, but you can't do that with a symphony.
No. But you also can't do it with a composer who doesn't orchestrate.
Well, that's true.
And it becomes way more difficult, obviously.
When you say a composer that doesn't orchestrate, what does that mean? Because for me, that doesn't compute.
Well, it's a composer who doesn't orchestrate.
A composer who might or might not be able to read music. And there've quite a few of those, or have been, and still are, who rely on orchestrators. And then the person up on the podium is not the composer. They may be the orchestrator, or they may not be either. So then if there's a director who doesn't like what's going on, it's quite a performance too.
Okay, so let me just say, just to clarify, that there are some composers, James Newton Howard is one. James prefers not to conduct, and he uses orchestrators. But he does that only because he doesn't have the time to sit and fill out the scores and all this. I mean, he can do all that stuff. I mean, he's very well qualified. John Williams doesn't fill out the whole big page, but he presents something that is fully. He provides a short score that is fully. All the notes are named and who plays it. I used to do the same thing. My sketch was basically a short score that copyists could just copy off of, and I prefer to conduct. Some composers who can conduct prefer not to conduct, but there are a lot of composers who can't conduct, and you hope will not conduct, and they hire somebody else who will be time for them. And then the other composers who really they really don't know enough about orchestration, but they can write the music. That was a thing all the way back to Tiomkin and Franz Waxman and those guys. They all had orchestrators, and their music would be fabulous. The orchestration was fabulous, but their music was basically made by a piano player.
But like you said before, as long as it works with the picture, that's all that matters.
Yeah,
So that's the idea.
Yeah.
But if you're sitting in I'm going to be in a rehearsal with an orchestra in a few months, and if that thing is not ready to go, if I can't just change it on the stand.
No.
There's no way to do it. How would I do it? They have these intricate parts, and I have maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes per rehearsal. We have maybe 2 or 3 of those. And the concert, and then it's performed in public. It's not going to be recorded,
right.
For a picture. It's going to be played in front of a bunch of people, and I can't just change it on the spot. I wish that there was a way.
So it's balance, basically.
Yeah.
You have to balance would be the big thing, wouldn't it?
Well, I don't really know. I mean, that's the thing. It almost feels like there's no room for any change when I'm writing a piece, and I feel like the same thing when I look at your scores. And the oboe concerto, I think, is a good example of that, because I feel like the string theory piece, you can kind of move things around. It's easier with that piece. But with the oboe concerto, the way that it's formed with the 3 movements and the way that the arc, you can't really change. You can't really take a bar out here and do this. And, okay, I want the horns to play that line. You can't really just copy paste it like that with a concert piece.
Yeah. So the other night, I had my premiere of a piece at Carnegie Hall, okay? I've been in Carnegie Hall exactly once before that, and I heard a piano recital. Barenboim played a bunch of Beethoven. So I'd never heard an orchestra in there. So these were wind groups, wind symphonies. And the sound wasn't what I was expecting. It was very, very specific. So I'm not sure that, and there were big groups too, so I'm not sure that my piece, which I'd never heard live before, was scored exactly the way I'd like. Also, one of the problems with bands is you never know how many people are going to show up, right? So you write it for one bass clarinet and you've got 16 sitting there instead, It kind of changes your balance. So I really couldn't tell between the acoustics in the room and the number of people in the group whether I had done the right thing or not. So you get to a symphony and you play it someplace like the Disney Hall in LA, or here in New York, like Carnegie Hall, or Houston, pick places we've been, Cleveland, also. All those rooms are different. And the balance you get in one room is not going to be the balance you're going to get in another room. Plus, the conductors don't listen to it the same way, and the players don't play it the same way. So all the things that are at work on a concert piece are in some ways more daunting than what they are in a movie, because in a movie, you generally know where you're going to record. You know basically who's going to play it, and you have a pretty good idea of the conditions all around, in the performance of it. It's also a very rigid performance. It has to be played like that at that tempo. Otherwise, it absolutely will not hit its mark.
And you're normally working in the same 2 or 3 rooms, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's not that many halls that you play.
Right. Like if I go to Fox, if we, like Belinda and I both have worked at Fox, sometimes together, sometimes not. I love that stage for the things that I do. Belinda, not so much. Because as a violinist,
it's a bit dry.
Yeah.
And bright.
But for me, I get this enormous high end. We did Silverado there, it's enormous high end, this really great, you got all the things going, but
You like the clarity of it,
yeah,
isn't
I
that
like
right?
the clarity of it, yeah.
Yeah.
And like
but you know when you're writing the thing, it's going to, like,
I
from the
wanted to
moment you get
record
hired.
that piece there because I knew that I would get it to sound like that. Warner Brothers is a good stage, but there's kind of like this over the top end. It doesn't have, the harmonics don't go all the way to the sky.
Also, the engineers. That's
engineers
another
are
thing. It's
very
like the
different.
conductor. They'll do their thing on top of it.
Yeah, the engineers are very different.
So it's interesting because, I mean, from what I'm getting out of this is that when you're writing for those halls, actually in some kind of way, you really know what the sounds are. But ironically, when you're writing concert music, even though the music might be more meticulous or more, you have more time per bar, let's say, to think about it. Actually, you don't really, the less you know what the final result will be, because you also don't know if they mic it. They don't know where they mic it. And a lot of concert pieces, they're mic'd horribly. You have just the stereo pair in the front, and that's it. And then you got the audience coughing and all this stuff.
So you have less control.
Well, I mean, even the recordings,
At the end of the day,
the recordings are all produced. And so if the producer likes the woodwinds or likes I remember listening to something, he really liked the triangle a lot, you know. But I'll give you a good example in the movies. John Powell. John Powell, who's he's a really good composer. He really knows what he's doing. He writes in lots of different styles. He's also a really cool guy. He did this wonderful score called How to Train Your Dragon. Okay, I love that score, right?
Yeah, nobody's heard of that.
No one's heard that. But I mean, it's really a wonderful score. It's really well written, all that stuff. He said to me a couple of years after it was over, he says, they're using this piece now in concerts. He said it was never meant to be used in a concert. He says, I should have had you look at it beforehand. You know? So I heard it. I was in Vienna, and they played the piece in the concert. And it's an orchestra. If you get 35 pieces together, like I tell my students, if you have 35 people, it's going to sound like something, And that sounded pretty much like the Dragon thing. But if you look at the score, the way that John records, he doesn't record with everybody in the same room all at once. Like in that score, he didn't have all the woodwinds, he didn't have all the brass, he didn't have all the strings and all the bagpipes and all the drummers. And they weren't all sitting in the same room. Some of those things aren't even notated in the score. So what you have is you have a score that looks like, for instance, it has 4 horn parts, but he has 12 horns playing. I said, why do you have 12 horns? He says, I like to hear the horns, But it doesn't sound out of balance because he knows that he's writing this for a recording situation. His woodwinds generally are not as many as he would probably need if it were an acoustical situation because the brass is so massive. Strings are pretty well taken care of. Bagpipes don't appear. The drums don't appear. All this stuff doesn't appear. When he mixes it together, he knows what he wants to hear and he knows what he's going to get. So this was meant for that. This was meant for that. It's not like writing a symphony.
Yeah, and the orchestrations are completely different.
Orchestrations are all different.
And then for you, when you're playing, do you prefer one way or the other? Do you prefer playing with just string colleagues, or would you rather have everybody, the whole band there? Really?
We need each other. We need to listen to pitch. I mean, it's really important that you listen like crazy, and that's what the symphonic players do. And when you're in the studio situation, it's so easy to just put the blinkers on and just play your part. And it's much better if you can play off of each other.
Also, you're asked to. Tell them about striping.
In the last probably 10, 15 years, it got to the point of you'd have 4 versions of a cue. It'd be just strings. And you'd have the long version, the long note version, the short note version, the fast version. You'd have I'm trying to remember them all now. There were 4 versions sometimes on some of these movies. Striping is a killer for the players. And sometimes they do have the whole orchestra in the room, and then you're sitting there while the first violins do their part. While the second violin, actually the first and seconds together, then the violas, or sometimes just the strings. You're sitting doing nothing a lot of the time, and then putting your part down. So
do they layer all that stuff?
Yeah, they layer it, yeah. So that's getting more and more far away from a symphonic situation, from a concert composer situation.
Because they can control it when they put the entire soundtrack together. Sound effects used to be called sound effects. Now it's called sound design. So a lot of the sound effects which used to just be recorded are now actually created. And frankly, it competes with music. So when you get on the dubbing stage, the thing that's always the most important is dialogue. So you have to be able to hear every line of dialogue clearly. And then music and sound, design or effects, whatever, make up the rest of it. And there's some pretty heated disagreements sometimes on the dubbing stage as to which one is going to play there. So if you put the track up there, and as happened to me one time, the triangle solos over traffic, you just break the entire music track down unless you've got it on a separate track. So it's the way that they have more control. So what you give up is, you give up the musicality, if there is any, in the performance, and that thing of the orchestra playing together, and the phrasing is similar, and the pitch is similar, and all those things.
See, that sounds unmusical to you, but to me, I'm thinking, oh man, if I had these tools like with the LA Phil or something, and I had enough rehearsal time to try different things and have different versions of different parts of the piece, this would be golden.
Yeah, but don't you think that I know why you say that, but don't you think that it would be cool to go, let's say, have the LA Phil play it, and then just go north and have the San Francisco symphony play it, and then run over to Houston. So you have all these different orchestras, and hear how your piece changes, because your piece it's not made for a movie. I mean,
It's not static.
in a movie, it's made to sound like that, always like that. So when people do Silverado or something like that, I hear it faster, slower. I hear it played different ways, but it's usually similar. But if you're doing a concert piece, somebody will, like particularly if you have a solo piece, somebody is actually going to play it different. They just are going to play it like they play Beethoven different. Isn't that a cool thing to look forward to?
Well, the thing is, when you're writing an orchestral, I mean, at least for me, I had one piece in particular where I had to hear it like 4 or 5 times by 5 different orchestras before I got the final version of the score down, because there'd be sections of it where I'm not sure was it the orchestra, was it the hall?
Yeah.
But then my rule is if I hear 2 orchestras doing the same thing that I don't like in that section, that's when I change it. Yeah. So
that's probably
it does take, like you said, multiple orchestras to know. Because after the first, when I hear a world premiere of my piece, it's, to me, it doesn't matter who it is, it's a throwaway performance. It's just this, because that's not going to be how the piece lives, if it does live after the first. What were you going to say?
Well, I've been thinking about what you said earlier. You wish it was more symbiotic between the concert composers and the film. I'm going to be the sort of odd man out here, but I find them very different. I find the art form very different, and I don't think they merge quite so easily, especially coming from film going to the concert. If you start in the concert world, you're studying it in a different way, you're learning it differently. But we've been to enough film concerts of film music that if there was not a visual up there, it's death.
Really?
The music's god awful, actually, without the visual. And I know it's not supposed to be. The point of it is, it's as you said, Bruce, it's written for the visual.
Yeah.
So you take the visual away, and oh my God, you don't want to hear it without the visual. So that's where I think, well, how are you going to? Where's the crossover?
Well, actually, some people do. I mean,
some are good, but I'm saying a lot of the stuff
They have film music fans. I mean, I've asked them about it. I said, "Do you ever listen to real music?" And they said, "No, well, we like I listen to Vaughan Williams and I listen to Tchaikovsky." And I go, "Okay, that's close." And they said, "But we like film music by itself." I mean, there are some people who just like that
visual.
style.
They are actually
Maybe.
seeing it while they're listening. Oh, I remember what happens there.
Yeah.
And you can't do that.
I mean, you say that the music, the film music, I mean, I kind of disagree with that, because I think that, you say the film music doesn't work on its own, but I also think if you took that same audience and put them in a concert hall with Thomas Otis, and then it opens with Tchaikovsky something, they would also get bored too at that, even though that music was written for the concert hall. It's just not the music that they like. At least that's what I think. I don't know if that's...
I have to think about that.
Well, that's probably why Beethoven gets played so much. It's the music people like to hear.
Another thing we've talked about, Bruce and I have talked about a lot, is listening to music. When we got together, I would listen to a performance, and Bruce was listening to a construction. And sometimes, if I was listening to a not very good performance, it would just drive me nuts, and would be there because you wanted to hear the piece, so you were listening to the way it was written. I'm listening. We would listen very differently. I mean, it's changed a lot now, but I never thought about people listening to music differently. When we got together, I hadn't even considered it, and I was frustrated. You were frustrated too. We were both frustrated with what we were getting out of it, because it was totally different.
Well, that's a really strong point, and it's been one that I've learned from a lot, because I've had to listen to performance when I listen to so-called concert pieces. In pop, performance is everything, right? I mean, the music may be not much of anything, but it's the performance that makes all the difference between this artist and that artist, particularly now. But in film, performance isn't so important. I mean, accuracy is important. And so a lot of the film composers, probably myself included, figure that if you hear the piece played the way you wrote it, it's a successful piece. But there are a lot. I have a friend, an older guy, older than I am, a composer who has had some of his concert pieces recorded. And Belinda's listened to it, and he says, "Boy, nobody did him any favors." And you listen to it and you think, yeah, that's right. That's really a kind of a crummy performance. Nobody really came up to the music. And this guy's pretty good. He came up to the music. In movies, it really doesn't matter so much as long as you come up to what the director wants.
Yeah.
I know that sounds terrible.
There's a sort of an extra. There's the notes and the dynamics, and then there's the performance. And sometimes it's hard to get the performance on top of that because the composers are still blown away by hearing a 60, 90-piece orchestra play what they've written in the studios, and they're so blown away by it, they don't ask for any more because they don't know this anymore. They assume they're getting everything on the first time round.
Yeah, but there's a mechanical reason too. Like years ago, again, I was working on Quincy. This was a long time ago, and the concertmaster's name was Erno Neufeld. Erno had been the concertmaster at Universal Films. He was an elderly guy, I was there, and he pretty much treated one television show like any other television show. Didn't matter who you were, you couldn't impress him. He had done everything, He had played with everybody, and he knew everybody. Okay, so one time in one of these episodes, I had a scene where there was a movie within the movie, and people were watching an old movie that was supposed to have come from the 30s, and it was a big love thing. So I wrote this big 1930s-like violin solo. He saw that music, and he stood up, and he took his stand, and he had the stand face the screen. He took the mic, and he moved the mic where you're going to come. This is the way he used to do it in the 30s and the 40s, And we started to play this thing, and he started to play this thing, and the sound that came out of that fiddle, I thought, wow, that's Erno, and that's what he was, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now, if he'd had his druthers, he could really have made that great if he didn't have to play to time, if he didn't have to play to my timings, if he'd had an extra half second there, or maybe 2 seconds there, all that kind of stuff where he could have phrased it in a way like the way Belinda phrases. She can break your heart the way she can phrase things. But sometimes it's nice to give her a couple more seconds, because when you're just trying to get it down to that, hit the kiss, something like that, it makes a big difference in performance. A lot of the music now doesn't make any difference. Like Belinda talked earlier about striping, you have the shorts and the longs. It's like there are so many sins of orchestration done just because people are making up all their music on keyboards. I have nothing against writing on keyboards. I have nothing against samplers, and I do them myself. But when you're getting all your orchestral ideas of thinking that in order to write a proper string part, you have to have guys going bop 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 bop, and you have other guys going da 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 da, and you say, "Excuse me, have you ever seen Mozart?" Mozart didn't need that, and you don't need that either. You need to learn how to write music. It's the stupid way of, or let's just say it's the stupid way, but it's also the backdoor way into composition and learning about orchestration.
Well, that's why, I don't know how it is when you write concert music, is that, at least when I write concert music, believe it or not, I do use Logic, I use a DAW, but I don't use any orchestral sounds, it's all piano sounds.
Oh, that's smart.
So I have layers, and I learned this from, I saw John Mackey.
Yeah.
He had a blog or something years ago. He was saying, I don't use any sounds except the piano sounds, when I'm listening back. I'm like, wow, that's actually a great idea, because if you can get behind, lose the piano sound in your head, it's just a bunch of notes.
Yeah.
You're just hearing pitches, and you can really focus on what you're actually hearing
Your
in your head.
imagination's better.
Yeah.
Like I heard that, I think it's a solo viola piece of yours, all the harmonics.
Yeah. It was a recent piece. Yeah.
That's not one I'd want to hear on a DAW.
No, I couldn't write it on a DAW.
I don't think I'd want to hear it on the piano either, but on the viola, it sounds really kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, you write it on the piano, of course, but then you have to say it's not going to sound like that. You just have to keep reinforcing that. And then if every piece you write is all pianos, then it kind of reinforces your imagination, I feel like. But I do use Sibelius. I'm sure you use Sibelius. People say, you shouldn't use this and that. You use whatever the heck is possible.
But you used to write your theme, you used to play your themes and things to a director on the piano.
The piano.
But it doesn't work that way now, does it? Because it's everybody.
No, you have to give them a mock-up. Like I did the main title to the Orville, this Seth MacFarlane show, and Seth doesn't demand mock-ups. He doesn't care. You go in and you look at the film, and you go home and you write it, and you come in and you do it with an orchestra, and it works there. It's great, But he needed it for the main title, because for the main title, Actually, the first demo I gave him was a piano sound, just the tune, you know, and then he needed an actual demo so they could cut to it, because now they're constructing a visual main title, so that's a little bit different. So then you fill out the orchestra and you put on all the phony violins.
That's for an actual purpose. They need it for something. It's not, I like it or I don't like it, and that kind of thing.
But some people start that, like, you know, what you're talking about, writing at the piano, it gives you the chance to let your imagination work, because if you know what in this case, a viola harmonic sounds like, you're saying, oh, well, this would be pretty good. This is going to sound great, and then I can do this, and I can do that. And then the piano is just the neutral way of being able to get to the information.
Yeah, and speaking of, I guess, viola harmonics or harmonics in general, you know, they don't sound the same on each string. Each string, you know, if on the thicker string, it's going to sound different. You can't go up as high on the shorter strings, and you know, there are certain things you just can't do without knowing how the instrument works. And if you're sitting there just tinkering in a DAW, it's just not gonna happen.
Because everything works on that.
It won't give you the difference between a fingered harmonic and an open harmonic.
Yeah, that, or you can do touch 3 harmonic, touch 4 harmonic, touch 5 harmonic, and all this kind of stuff. Artificial harmonic, it's all crazy. And then what do you do with the bow? And all this kind of stuff, you know, it's not just...
It also doesn't give you the difference between fourth position on the G string or on the C string.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or even if it sounds fortissimo, it sounds extremely different than if it's pianissimo.
Yeah.
Or, you know, I know some composers that they mark a harmonic, but they don't even want to hear a sound. You know, it's just like air, you know, almost, and that kind of thing. Or I've done a piece where I say, you know, play that harmonic, but don't worry if you don't get that sound. I want to have that grit. So there are these, you know, the spectrum that you get in your imagination, but you don't get in the DAW.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of... That's to me why I think film composers and concert composers, there is an interesting intersection, because nowadays we're all using the same tools, actually, in reality. Like, I'm using Logic, I use it every day, and I use Sibelius, and film composers, they use Sibelius or some version of that, and Logic or Cubase or whatever. So technologically speaking, we're all sitting in front of a computer, like a film composer's desk. Looks very similar to mine.
I was looking earlier thinking, gosh, that's familiar.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of sound design now in the music.
So that's why I wonder, you know, and I have friends of mine, you know, around my age or a little older, that they want to get into film music if their concert music matches what that film needs. And there have been people like Mason Bates, people like that have started to delve into that world a little bit. So I think it's interesting, and my teacher at Juilliard, John Quiliano, he did a little bit of that.
Actually, John's a really good film writer. I mean, he really understands it. He was Copeland was another one. Mm-hmm. Both those guys really understood how film worked. They understood the timings.
Too.
No, these guys more the Prokofiev. I'm not sure. I don't think Prokofiev wrote entirely to time the way that these guys did. These guys both did the American. I mean, I've seen John talk about it. And I know that Copeland did it. I mean, I'm not knocking Prokofiev's music. That stuff works great. Yeah. But in terms of the way the Hollywood technique was, like, we all used to work with stopwatches. I still work with a stopwatch to time my phrases and things. And those guys knew how to do that. They know the difference between this and that. Yeah,
or Korngold or people like that. So it's just interesting to see. Like, it kind of waned a little bit, and then I hope that it's something like that reemerges again. We'll see.
Yeah, it's too bad, you know, that it's too bad that there are so many different kinds of music that have become so sort of radicalized. Like, if you like film music, it used to be, there was just movie music, and then there was pop music, and then there was long-haired music, classical music, you know. Well, now there's this kind of classical music, and there's this kind of movie music, and there's this kind of pop music, and people prefer this, and they don't know about that, and it's really hard to keep up with all the kinds of music there is, which, again, goes back to your point about hoping that the two worlds, you know, we only were talking about two worlds, but the film and the concert world, you know, melding and hearing each other. But the truth is, once you get into concert music, there's tons of it that have guys, I try to keep up. I don't do it so well, but occasionally I hear a piece done by somebody that's really, really, really interesting. Completely unusual, completely unusable for a film thing, except in the technique. And I'll sit there and I'll think, okay, so this technique, this would be a cool. I wonder if I could make this work for a blah blah blah, or, something like that. And then you hear a sound that you never thought about making out of instruments that you know really well. And you think, oh, well, maybe I could use that. I got to remember. There's all sorts of ways that you can have one influence the other.
Didn't you mention a sound, something Sard wrote with the woodblock and the... Who was that? Was that Sard? You listened to that recently. Was it the violas and woodblock? The combination of the woodblock and something... What was that?
What was that? Gosh.
That was something that... It was very... Wasn't that Sard?
Yeah, it was you.
Yeah, it was your...
You had the piano concerto.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you've got this thing where the piano is going... And then you've got the woodblocks. I listened to that. I thought, "Whoa, that's cool."
Really?
Yes, that was exactly what you were talking
about. I thought
about.
that was really slick.
Yeah.
And I thought, "Wow, I never thought about that." I mean, I know woodblocks, I know piano, but I never thought to put them together that way.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought, oh, this is. I thought the opposite. I'm like, oh, this is such a simplistic way to do it. Whatever.
was very,
but I was
very
running out of
effective.
time. Okay, let me do it.
I thought it was very
I thought it
effective.
worked really great.
See, I thought I had a different feeling
But see,
about
you're
it
looking at it a
altogether.
different way. You're looking at it as a construction. You're not just sitting there listening to the sound. I'm just sitting listening to the sound. You go, oh, that's
You're
cool.
what they call knee deep in your own poo-poo.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. That's how we feel. That's a great way to end the show too. So, check out Bruce's music. I put it down in the description below. And if you want to hear Belinda, I guess you can hear her on Man of Steel. And where else can we hear you?
Well, you won't hear her on Man of Steel, that's for sure.
What's
Too many
Man of-
explosions.
Oh.
I don't know why Man of Steel is the first thing in my
the
mind. but
movies. I can give you a bio. I have a bio on my computer.
I'll put that in the description. I'll put both of your bios in the description and
That
maybe
would
some
be easier.
key things for anybody interested. If you got this far, then that means you're interested for sure. All right, thanks guys.
Yeah, thank you.
That was
Thank you.
great fun.